Hi everyone, it's Rachel back with the Shades of Orange, and today I'm here to bring you a best of the year so far video. I've decided only to focus on 2022 new releases, so only books that came out this year. And so if you want to know the best backlist books I have, you'll have to wait till year end, so definitely consider subscribing. And just to make this list a little bit more interesting, I decided to exclude sequels, so that means that books like these were not included in the consideration for this list. And I want to highlight 8 books, and so for this video I'm going to highlight 3 fantasy books and 5 science fiction. Yes, I know a lot of you would probably think it would make more sense if I did 4 and 4, but because I read and enjoy more science fiction, my video ended up being weighted a little bit more that way. And I did want to do this video early enough in the year because, from my opinion, when I see other people do these best of the year lists, they often will do them later in the summer or even in the fall, and then a couple months later they're posting their final best of the year list, and I find they can be really repetitive. So I want to do this early enough to highlight books that I honestly do enjoy, I like them, but they weren't necessarily 5 stars, and so it's going to be interesting to see whether or not these books make my final list at the end of the year, or if better books come along and knock them off. But again, if you're trying to figure out which new releases are worth your time, which ones are worth the hype, hopefully this list will be a great reading guide. And all that being said, let's get started. First, at the number 3 spot for fantasy, we have The Shadowglass by Josh Winning. And this is more of an urban fantasy, which is not normally what I'm drawn to. So again, I'm curious if it will make my end of the year list. But this is a story that follows a man whose father was known for making these famous puppets in these films back in the 1980s. His father has now passed away, and his son is now dealing with his house and estate. And well, he finds out that possibly the puppets were actually real and do come to life, and the story goes from there. This definitely has elements of horror, but it definitely leans more on the side of fantasy, which is why I'm including it in this video. And if you can't tell from the synopsis, yes, this one is heavily influenced by Jim Henson's work, particularly I would say Labyrinth and The Dark Crystal. So if you love those films, this is definitely a love letter to them, and it's really enjoyable. It's funny, it's entertaining, it's lighthearted, but also, like I said, a little bit creepy, and it's just very enjoyable. Like I said, I do have a preference typically for epic fantasy, so the fact that this one caught my attention and held it really says a lot to how enjoyable it was, and it's just a really fun one. And I will say that typically when I think of my best of the year list, I'm more drawn towards like dark, depressing, grimdark fantasy. So I'll be curious if something more lighthearted and fun manages to hold up months later. But right now, I'm still thinking about it. I really enjoyed it, and I do recommend it to any Jim Henson fans. I think that you will enjoy it as well. It definitely references those works, but at the same time, it definitely stands up on its own and makes for just a really fun read. Then at the number 2 spot for fantasy, we have The Bladed Faith, and this is the first book in a new epic fantasy series where we follow a man who, right at the beginning of the story, not a spoiler, his parents are brutally murdered. His parents happen to be the king and queen of this land, and there is a warring outside force that has taken over, and so they slaughter the rulers, but they decide to leave the prince alive as a bit of a hostage. Through circumstances, he ends up being able to escape and goes off with a group of rebels. From there, they teach him how to fight so that he can hopefully one day take his revenge and return to the ruling crown. And so this story is a classic fantasy revenge story, but it's one that's done very well. It's a plot I enjoy, but I've read a lot and sometimes I get tired of it. This one, even though it wasn't outside the box, it wasn't incredibly unique, it was incredibly compelling. I found myself immediately rooting for the main character, and while there are other perspectives, they tie in really nicely, which makes for a really cohesive narrative, because you can easily see how each of the perspectives fit into the larger plot, and so it was easy to follow. I'm dying for more. And again, if you love revenge stories, this is one of the best, and I really enjoyed it, can't stop thinking about it, and obviously highly recommend it since it's in this video. Then at the number 1 spot for fantasy, the fantasy book to beat this year is The Justice of Kings by Richard Swan. This is a story that follows a man who is the justice of the land, so he works as the judge, jury, and sometimes executioner, serving the king's justice throughout throughout the land. He travels around. The story is told not from his perspective, but from his assistant, a young woman who works with him and chronicles his tales. And we get to see him from the outside, which I think was a really good choice because he's incredibly cool, he's incredibly mysterious, and I think that the story works best when we don't get to see inside of his mind directly, but only get to see his actions and of course hear his words. This is a story that started out a little bit slow, but when it got going, oh my gosh, I was absolutely gripped in. The second half of the story, I flew through and just could not stop turning the pages. It's a good balance of mystery and intrigue and political upheaval, and the character work I thought was really good, and more so the writing was fantastic. I'm not normally someone who gushes about prose, but these prose were so good. And again, I read this book a couple months ago now, and I just am continuing to think about it. I have not read a new release fantasy that is this good in quite a while, and again, I'll be really interested to see where it lands in my final best of the year list. I suspect it's going to be really high. Right now it's at the top, and I'm curious to know if anything will end up beating it out before year's end. Now, switching over to science fiction, I'm going to give you a top 5. Starting in the number 5 position, we have Deep Dive by Ron Walters, and this is a story of a software programmer who gets the opportunity to test drive some new virtual reality equipment. He tries it on, goes into the VR world, and when he comes out, something goes terribly wrong, and he finds out that his life has changed and his daughters appear to not actually exist. He then has to go and of course find out what happened. This book is definitely reminiscent of something like Dark Matter, but I'm also happy to say that it goes in a different direction. It uses different science fiction elements, and while it definitely plays on similar themes about a man trying to get back to his family, it certainly stands up on its own. This is a page turner. It's a science fiction thriller, one that is just easy to get through, and I find that that's a genre that can be very hit or miss with me, and this was obviously a hit since it ends up on this list. I thought it was a lot of fun, very entertaining, very easy to get through, easy to follow, a great place to start for beginners who are interested in getting more into science fiction, and yeah, I just thought it was overall a lot of fun. Then at number 4, we have 36 Streets by T.R. Napper, and this is a cyberpunk novel that follows a young woman who works as a gangster in a part of Vietnam where she is from that is controlled by China. She has to survive, she has to deal with gang life. In the beginning of the story, she gets pulled into a murder mystery, someone dies, and she has to investigate what happens. And as I said, this entire story is set in a cyberpunk universe, so the world building within the story is incredibly rich, and I will fully admit that cyberpunk is not normally my favorite subgenre. I love the aesthetics of it in film and video games, but when it comes to the page, for whatever reason, maybe my brain isn't the most visual, sometimes I just don't find it as interesting. It tends to be very action focused and sometimes doesn't have the same heart or character focus that I want, but this book really balanced all those elements. I thought our protagonist was incredibly compelling, but I also, like I said, fell in love with the world, and I found that the action was enough to keep the plot going, but it didn't feel over the top or rushed, and so it just had the right balance of all the things that I want to have in a cyberpunk story. Within the plot, you have this video game that is coming out that is reproducing the US-Vietnam War, and that gets tied into the story, and I love when there's like video games within the world, and it just again had all the elements I really like and just gave me that relief of feeling like I finally understand why people like cyberpunk so much, because this one was really well done and definitely one that I would love to return to. Then at number 3, we have Mickey 7 by Edward Ashton, and this follows a man who works in a future where they have the ability to bring people back to life as kind of clones of themselves and give them back their memories. And so he works as what is considered a disposable employee, so he's tasked with doing these incredibly dangerous jobs with the idea that, well, if he dies on the job, they'll just bring him back to life, so it's no big deal. He, of course, experiences a death and everything that follows, and so it's not the best employment situation. This book, as you can probably guess, is a great commentary on the fact that workplaces can really treat their employees as disposable. I think it's very topical, and within the story you have a lot of fun because at the beginning of the story you find out that they possibly bring a clone back to life by accident too soon, and so there's possibly more than one Mickey who is in this universe, and you get some really good banter between the Mickeys, and the story is just very enjoyable. This is one I would recommend for those of you that love like John Scalzi or the Dennis E. Taylor books, things like that. That more lighthearted science fiction, but at the same time, this book I think has a lot of depth, a lot of interesting commentary that makes the book a little bit more than a surface level read, and one that I found to be more memorable than I expected. And so again, I think it has a good balance of being entertaining, but also very thoughtful. And yeah, I just really enjoyed it. It was fun. Again, as I've said in this video before, I do have a preference for really dark and depressing books. So I'll be interested to see how a book that is more fun and entertaining lands on my end of the year list. But for now, it's completely holding up. I read it just a little while ago and I'm still thinking about it, still thinking that it was enjoyable and would love to read it again. Then at number 2, we have Dark Theory by Wick Welker, which is a new book in a epic science fiction series. And in the story, it begins with an artificial intelligent robot waking up without their memory. The only thing they know is that they need to find a particular person, this engineer that they believe to be their maker. They end up teaming up with this thief who wants to retire. But through the story, you find out that there are larger things going on. This is set in a future where humanity has regressed into having fiefdoms, and you have warlords and different rulers that are fighting and vying for power, and they get pulled into a larger story. This is described as a book that reads a little bit more like sci fantasy, but I don't mean that in a bad way. It just follows some of the tropes that you would normally see in that genre. So I can say that despite the length, this one is very accessible, especially for those that again read perhaps more fantasy than science fiction. But I also think that it has appeal for those of you that prefer science fiction, because that's personally me. And I feel like this book really holds up. It just felt fresh, entertaining. It's got great humorous lines and funny banter, but also enough plot and high stakes that it really kept me invested, because I want a story that will keep me feeling very serious and worried for the characters and worried for the future of the world. Needless to say, I'm dying for more. As I mentioned, it's the beginning of a series and I really want book 2. But in the meantime, if you haven't caught up, I highly recommend this first one because it totally holds up as the beginning of this new series. Finally, at the number 1 spot for science fiction, the book to beat this year, and I've got to say it's going to be a tough book to beat because I really love this one, but I want to recommend How High We Go in the Dark. This is a piece of post-apocalyptic fiction that is technically a novel, but it reads almost a bit more like short stories because each chapter is set in a different perspective and has a different focus. It jumps over courses of time, and you follow humanity as they deal with this viral outbreak, one that targets children especially, and you get to see what happens after this outbreak begins, and again the course of history as it unfolds. This is a story that starts out a bit slower, you're kind of piecing it together. It also is incredibly emotional, especially for those like myself that are parents. This book really pulls on some heartstrings, and I am not typically an emotional reader, so if you are an emotional reader, beware, this book, it might kill you. But oh my goodness, this book really hit me in the feels, and then it's one that just really draws you in. So again, it's a slower read. You're kind of wondering how these different perspectives are going to fit together. But as the story progresses, it builds and it builds. And I do really encourage you to stick it out to the end, because when I finally got to the ending, oh, it blew my mind. It was not what I expected. And it made the story more epic and more unexpected than I thought. I'm not normally actually someone who loves post-apocalyptic fiction, especially this day and age. I think a lot of us need a lot more hope. But the way that the story came together really changed my whole opinion of the book as it went through. It's one that I absolutely want to reread, and I just cannot stop thinking about. Easily one of the most memorable science fiction books I've read this year, new release or not, and I really think it's going to hold up over the course of time. Highly recommend it. Please go read it. I feel like it's underhyped and I need to change that. So that is it for this video. I would love to know, of the books I talked about, which ones are you planning on checking out for yourself? And I would also love to hear what is the best 2022 science fiction fantasy that you have read so far this year. If I haven't yet, I will be putting out a list for horror and thrillers, but I'll be honest, I still probably need to read a few more before I'm prepared to publish that list. But if you're new to my channel, please consider sticking around. I do read a lot of adult science fiction fantasy as well as horror and thrillers, as I said. And if you are already subscribed, thank you so much. You can still help me out by giving this video a thumbs up, sharing it around online, hitting that little notification bell so that you never miss a video. And if you drop a comment, even like a little spaceship or a fantasy wizard hat, I don't know what they're called, that also helps me out apparently with the YouTube algorithm. And otherwise, I will talk to you again really soon. Thanks for watching. Okay, bye-bye.